I'm going to be talking, I guess, about a related case study from Vanuatu to do with increasing women's political participation. Sorry for that noise, it's a bit annoying. My role in this, as Tate's already mentioned, is as an anthropologist with an interest in how Indigenous values have been brought into the public service and state institutional settings in Vanuatu. And I've been carrying out research through La Trobe with the Pacific Leadership Program focused on the reform process in Vanuatu that's resulted in the introduction of temporary special measures at the municipal level to introduce reserved seats for women in each of the council wards in Port Vila and also in Luganville municipalities in Vanuatu. The relevant bit of legislation was passed in 2013. Sorry, I'm just going to have to move this one more time. All right, let's stop there. Legislation was passed in 2013 to bring in reserved seats for women, and in actual fact, it's a very interesting story, but they had to do a new piece of legislation, a new amendment in 2014. I don't have time to go into details about that, which has brought about some changes to the voting methods and so on, which was tried out for the first time in the municipal elections in Luganville in the middle of last year. This is addressing the low levels of female representation in Vanuatu in elected office at all levels, in line with other Pacific nations, but perhaps even fewer women make it into Parliament in Vanuatu, for instance, than do in the case of Samoa. That's not to say that Samoa is somehow winning necessarily, but we've just had another election in Vanuatu and no women have been elected into Parliament. I think that's the second parliamentary term where there'll be no female MPs. Women do occupy leadership positions in Vanuatu, most frequently though in NGOs or through churches, but few have ever been elected into office at any level of government or have occupied high public service ranks either. Temporary special measures, as most of you probably know better than I do, emerged sort of at the same time as a lot of the kind of, through CEDAW, around the time that was ratified in various Pacific countries. It became a sort of topic of conversation, and lobbying began for that to be a potential way to address the low levels of female participation in politics. The particular trajectory, though, of lobbying in Vanuatu has interestingly shifted away from civil society involvement. And this has been the focus of the PLP involvement and also my research. There's a coalition, as they say, although the existence of it or otherwise is always a bit confusing, and who's in it, no one's ever quite sure, and so on. But it's known as Women in Shared Decision Making. And this has been has a sort of central leadership figure in the Director of Women's Affairs, Doris Day Kenneth. A lot of my perspective on this comes from conversations with Doris Day, and she is very keen to admit that she occupies quite a strong and authoritative leadership position, and she's steered these temporary special measure reforms through a variety of challenges. There's a really interesting division that she makes between the coalition and the task force, and she's always very keen to emphasise that it's a task force that has actually assisted her most in bringing about these the legislative amendment in 2013. This is comprised of Department of Women's Affairs staff, the director, sometimes her deputy, who was actually, we hoped to have her speaking today, but she wasn't able to make it, unfortunately. A high-profile MP, Ralph Regan-Vanu, who Anna's already talked about, and also staff of the State Law Office and the Electoral Office, the National Statistics Office, and a Vila-based academic acting in an advisory role are all seen to be the main players in this task force behind the introduction of the TSMs. Further advice and mentoring has come through donors, particularly the PLP. I'm realising as I'm saying this that I'm trying to compress what was like quite a long journey towards legislative change into a really short period of time. What I decided to do perhaps, and you can ask more in the question period, if you want more details about how the legislation was formulated and passed, etc. I wanted to highlight some of the issues and challenges that the Director of Women's Affairs has highlighted as part of the journey towards achieving this particular reform. I'm hoping that this will speak to the issue of positive deviance from a number of angles, which I'll try and highlight in my conclusion. Some of the reasons why I think the task force or coalition model was ultimately successful in pushing through these reforms was to do with the context of sort of disruption and conflict, particularly with the Vanuatu National Council of Women over the last 10 years or so, 5-10 years. Sorry, I'm just looking at Anna, like to give me the details. But anyway, there was sort of conflict, reduced capacity and so on. So this meant that what might have been the logical civil society central organising kind of location, if you want, for reforms around gender equity, gender advocacy and so on, wasn't seen to be quite up to the job. That's not a professional way to term it necessarily. However, hopefully you'll forgive me. We are being filmed though, aren't we? Anyway. There was a desire on the part of the Director of Women's Affairs as well to make her mark. She had chosen the area of women's political participation and representation as the area that she really wanted to see as her kind of legacy in that position. So that was one of the relevant contextual issues around pushing these reforms through. And also, some of you will know a little bit about the very difficult passage of the Family Protection Bill in Vanuatu from the 1990s onwards. This was a piece of legislation which was aiming to increase the sort of legal mechanisms for dealing with domestic and gender-based violence and so on, which took years and years to pass for various reasons, met opposition from a lot of different quarters, particularly around the idea that it was favouring women and so on. And so it became a piece of legislation that was in many ways ghettoised through this sort of idea that it was a women's issue and that it was trying to perhaps override an Indigenous model of gender complementarity. That's the usual debate, universal rights versus Indigenous perceptions of gender, etc. I'm not going to rehash that there because, we hear plenty about it. However, these issues have been addressed in various interesting ways, particularly by the Director of Women's Affairs. In terms of the first one, the reduced capacity of CSOs in the context of gender advocacy in Vanuatu, she took on a very strong leadership role. I'd actually written about it recently. I think I'd used the term policing, and when she read that, she wasn't upset by that. She's perfectly happy with the idea that she was quite an authoritative leader in these circumstances. This involves shoulder tapping those who she saw as most likely to be able to help her achieve these legislative reforms, rather than just accepting the assistance or encouraging the inclusion of anyone who was interested in the issue. This included basically closing out civil society sort of involvement while still actually holding meetings to keep people informed about what was going on to some degree. She did very consciously say to people, I'll include you, but not now. And so it was a way of demonstrating also that policy initiatives in this area could successfully come out of the public service. I think from her professional standpoint, that was something that was important to her as well. I've mentioned the sort of two-stream approach that relates to that, having a coalition, which is what she describes that as those who were linked to the issue but were not the people who were necessarily in her task force. So that was another way that she kind of tried to control the reform process as well. And I linked this to Anna's outlining this morning of that idea about convergence and narratives. The Coalition for the Director of Women's Affairs is the larger group who are on the same page, as it were, with the task force, but the task force is the grouping with responsibility for the process of change. Interestingly, the Director of Women's Affairs also timed this reform process, or she talks about that perhaps in retrospect at least, to tie it in with other reforms that were going on in Vanuatu, particularly the land reforms that Anna talked about and the constitutional amendments that ensued from that. And also with planned electoral reforms that are ongoing in Vanuatu. So the decision to pursue temporary special measures has been embedded in the specific policy environment of Vanuatu, not just tied to external drivers in the area of gender equity. The alignment of TSMs with partners in the electoral office in particular and the state law office has been a really interesting and I think quite successful part of this process too. What the director has done here is she's allowed other people to take on the public face, the public roles connected to promoting the passage of this legislation to politicians and then also to voters. So this is a way of avoiding that idea of it being just a women's issue or that ghettoisation problem that we saw with the Family Protection Bill. Interestingly, she has aimed at the level of legislative reform in the first place. The task force has aimed for legislation to be passed rather than focusing on awareness, as it's often called in Vanuatu, or processes of attitudinal change. So they've taken what I refer to as the kind of build it and they will come model of, sort of pass the legislation and then the voters can just deal with it. And the voters do pretty much just deal with it. At the municipal level, there hasn't been an uprising of, angry voters saying, how dare you make me vote for a woman? This has actually just been, people are like, yeah, okay, hear me, time blow, get in now. That kind of acceptance. Quickly, because I've got 1 minute, relating this to the conference theme of positive deviance, hopefully, maybe. Some issues perhaps for consideration or theoretical elaboration at some later date around that idea of inclusivity. Because I think in conversation, Chris, you've mentioned the idea that perhaps there's a sort of positive deviancy here, not so much in defying the Indigenous model for change or a locally driven model for change, but perhaps there are aspects of this reform process that have challenged more normative development processes, particularly around ideas of inclusivity, who is included and who decides who's included in this process, particularly driving it from the public service rather than being as supposedly incorporative of other people's perspectives as, involvement of CSOs, etc., etc. It's also relevant on another level, which is that issue of attitudinal change. Interestingly, I think that more awareness has been directed towards political parties because they're actually seen as probably the most problematic group. If you're wanting to get more women into politics, you're going to have to convince the political parties to have women candidates. And this is where the energy is actually going. However, this isn't called awareness, it's actually lobbying, So this is something that is taking place. And when I was writing this, I wrote the weird phrase non-public. So it takes place in non-public, as I like to call it. But I realised that I was hesitant to use the phrase private because I think it's really important, this next issue, that being transparency. I think that this is a concept that it potentially needs to be broken down a little bit more, perhaps just in the context of Vanuatu, but perhaps elsewhere, to address whether there's a difference. We need to see a difference between secrecy and invisibility. I think for the TSM reforms, while the process might not be clearly visible to all, there's been no attempt to hide the knowledge that the reform process is underway. And I think that's an important point in the context of Vanuatu, because there are very strong cultural prohibitions on hiding your intentions. The final point, if you'll humour me for 1 minute, please, Tate, thank you, is that issue of thinking and working politically and risk and so on. I think there's an interesting issue here about what the boundaries of a reform project might be, and this might be relevant for some of you as sort of donors or thinking in that way yourselves. When you get into helping out with a reform project, where does it begin and where does it end? It relates to Anna's point about progressive change being non-linear, and I think TSMs are a great way to see this, as they appear to be almost logically teleological, like the sort of idea that the ultimate aim has to be increase women's participation at national level. You can't just stop at municipal level or something like that. However, they're actually more of a kind of circling up and through different scales, different levels and so on, and with each new scale that you enter into in this process of reform, new networks and associations are formed. So now political parties and constitutional amendments and electoral reform and so on are really what this has become most closely aligned to, rather than being a gender advocacy sort of reform project based predominantly with the Department of Women's Affairs. some of you might have read an article by Marilyn Strathern called Cutting the Network. I might not have chosen my audience quite right for that one, but anyway, the reference might ring bells for some of you. And I think it's an interesting idea, this idea that, you know, as each network emerges at the point at which a new form of property, what she talks about property rights in the article, but it's almost like you can transfer that idea to things such as when a new form of voting practice or something emerges, then a new set of networks necessarily emerges. And I think it's important to kind of, at each point at which that happens, to be aware of which aspects of the network have been cut and which ones have emerged. Yeah, so there you go. Thanks.